Okay. Hello. A very warm welcome to you all. Good afternoon from ESCAP East and Northeast Asia office here in Incheon, Korea. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this East and Northeast Asia virtual policy dialogue on the economic and social survey of Asia and the Pacific 2020. So before I begin, allow me to extend my personal wish to everyone that you and your loved ones are keeping healthy and safe at this precarious time. Indeed, we are engaging in this virtual policy dialogue this afternoon at this challenging time when we are all faced with this still evolving challenges and of how this COVID-19 pandemic is upending and disrupting the norms and orders we are used to. It's without doubt that this economic deceleration from COVID-19 pandemic will be accurate and broad-based and very sharp for the vulnerable populations in our societies. To this end, the governments across the world, East and Northeast Asia included, have set in motion policy measures and socioeconomic packages to address the impact of COVID-19 pandemic geared toward recovery. As ESCAP's flagship publication, the Economic and Social Survey of Asia and the Pacific 2020 pointed out, the considerable headwinds we are facing right now in the view of the pandemic may threaten the progress already achieved towards sustainable development. It is in this context that ESCAP takes on the strategic view and development approach that is in charting our paths toward recovery. We could also build back better in line with 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. To this end, we at the ESCAP are committed to do our part as well. During the 76th Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific held last week on the 21st of May, ESCAP's Executive Secretary Armida Salsiadis Jabana underscored that in order to support countries in building back better, refocusing our work in ESCAP is necessary. All ESCAP member countries share this strong commitment, as demonstrated by their collective endorsement of resolution on regional cooperation to address the socioeconomic effects of pandemics and crises in Asia and the Pacific. With this in mind, 3 priority areas will be given focus. First, supporting economic recovery. Second, protecting people in enhancing resilience. And third, restoring supply chains and supporting small and medium enterprises. And all these while urging countries to align policies with environmental protection and climate action. We duly recognize that this journey back to recovery will be neither be easy nor straightforward. As it already was even before the pandemic, we have been already facing a difficult path towards sustainable development. As such, we welcome opportunities such as today's virtual policy dialogue that provides us a platform to have balanced and informed exchanges of views and experiences, helping us distill the most pressing issues at this challenging time. The year 2020 marks the start of the decade of action with the 2030 timeline on the horizon. We cannot afford to be sidetracked or to digress. Instead, let us aim to seize all and every opportunity to ensure that we are heading in the same direction. The path towards post-pandemic recovery is the same path towards achieving 2030 agenda. At this point, let me shift gear to commence the presentation session of today's policy dialogue. In the next hour and a half, 1.5 hour, we are looking forward to sharing with you the highlights and recommendations of ESCAP's 2020 survey. In addition, through the experiences of East and Northeast Asian countries, we are also looking forward to hearing perspectives from our panelists on how policy measures supporting post-pandemic recovery could also promote sustainable means of consumption and production. And we envisage a productive discussion session in the end, which we hope would be enriched further by viewers' active participation through your questions and comments. Now, may I introduce my ESCAP colleague, Ms. Jyoti Bisbee, to present on the key outcomes and recommendations of the Economic and Social Survey of Asia and the Pacific 2020. Jyoti is the Economics Affairs Officer in the Macroeconomic Policy and Analysis section of ESCAP. She has devoted years of work on development finance, public investment management, public financing policies, project financing, and developing capital market financing instruments. Jyoti, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gunvald. So let me share my screen. All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm here to present the Economic and Social Survey 2020 with key recommendations on aligning post-COVID-19 recovery towards sustainability. The main message of the report is while Asia Pacific has been growing rapidly, it is not on track to achieve any of the SDGs. Progress towards SDGs is impeded by multiple disasters and climate risks, as well as growing consumption, which is outpacing population and income growth. We have been warned again and again that we are facing a climate emergency and that we need to prepare for the impact, but we haven't. This is evident from the crisis posed by the current COVID-19 pandemic, which may have been less severe if emergency preparedness measures had been established ex ante. So what can we do? We need collective action by all stakeholders, governments at the local level, businesses and consumers at the people level, and intergovernmental cooperation at the global level to address our consumption and production patterns, which is also SDG Goal 12. We need to rethink Asia Pacific's current economic growth-centric development that has driven world economic growth by maintaining high growth rates in the past decades, but has come with costs to people and the planet. The doubling of the region's GDP in the past 2 decades has contributed to job creation, income growth measured by GDP per capita, lifting over 1 billion people out of extreme poverty. However, if we flip the line of poverty reduction, we will realize that those lifted out of extreme poverty are still vulnerable. And if we raise our ambitions on poverty reduction from 1.9 to 3.2 per day, or to $5.5 per day, we can see that the number of people pulled above the high poverty lines is quite marginal, and the reduction is almost stagnant in recent years. Additionally, the region faces high level of inequality. As the figure shows, the top 10% of income group take away half of the income. Most worrisome is a GDP growth-centric development's cost to our planet. The region's pursuit of resource-dependent GDP growth has resulted in surging resource use, which has contributed to massive increase in carbon dioxide emissions and heightened the region's climate risks. Some similar trends are observed in East and Northeast Asia. Economic growth has contributed to income growth, job creation, and reduction in extreme poverty. However, if we raise our ambition beyond $90 a day, extreme poverty line, the reduction in poverty is at a slower pace, at 3 $1.20 a day and $5.50 a day. And also high resource dependent economic growth has been accompanied by rising CO2 emissions. The economic gains are not equally distributed as well. For example, in China, the top 10% income group has taken the majority of the income. Such unbalanced development holds our region back from achieving sustainable development. As seen in the figure, the Asia-Pacific region is not on track to achieve any of the 17 development goals, as set by the United Nations 2030 Agenda. In particular, Goal 12, responsible consumption and production, has regressed the most, along with Goal 13 on climate change, to which it is closely linked. In East and Northeast Asia, there is progress in Goal 12. However, progress is very little and has been stagnant. As you may not be fully aware what the Goal 12 entails, I'd like to provide a bit more background. Goal 12 sets out 8 main targets and several sub-targets for the purpose of ensuring sustainable consumption and production patterns, which is instrumental to achieve sustainable development. These include sustainable resource management, sustainable business practices, sustainable tourism, sustainable public procurement, market mechanisms, sustainable living, sustainable finance, and so on. Given Goal 12's close linkages with other goals, transforming our consumption and production patterns and making them more sustainable can also be an effective way to accelerate progress towards the 2030 agenda. Unfortunately, the progress towards sustainable development is likely to be set back by the recent COVID-19 pandemic, which has not only resulted in loss of lives and adverse health consequences, but also negative socioeconomic effects that have arisen as a result of containment measures, such as travel restrictions, suspension of production, and lockdown of cities through demand side, supply side, financial market, and cross-border channels. It is likely that Asia-Pacific's economic performance will be significantly impacted by COVID-19. The region's total GDP growth is expected to decrease by more than 4 percentage points. The GDP growth of East and Northeast Asia in particular is expected to decrease as well. All the quick containment measures have slowed down the spread of the virus and limited the downgrade of GDP growth to about 4 percentage points. Key policy responses to mitigate the adverse health and socioeconomic impact of COVID-19 crisis include fiscal measures, monetary policies, and regional efforts. A consolidated summary of these responses can be found in UNESCAP's recently published COVID-19 Dynamic Policy Tracker and Policy Brief. Large and targeted fiscal measures are necessary to contain COVID-19, safeguard livelihoods, and guarantee minimum living standards. As of end of April, most countries in our region have announced fiscal packages ranging from 0.1% to 20% of GDP, with a median of about 2.8%. In particular, at the sub-regional level, countries in East and Northeast Asia, these countries are increasing public spending at a relatively larger scale on average, followed by countries in the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Fiscal policies introduced by East and Northeast Asian countries to safeguard lives and livelihoods include cash handouts to households, tax relief for businesses, social insurance contribution, deductions, or exemption for individuals. Monetary policy, on the other hand, is important to help sustain business operations and support the health and stability of the financial sector. Monetary responses to provide liquidity and preserve financial stability by East and Northeast Asian countries include conducting open market operations, reducing policy rates, establishing currency swap lines with the US Federal Reserve. It is equally important to enhance regional cooperation when combating COVID-19. Some actions that the region can take are coordinating debt relief or deferral of debt repayments for those that lack fiscal space to roll out large and targeted fiscal packages, and coordinating capital flows to maintain foreign exchange market stability, such as establishing new bilateral currency swap lines or tapping on existing bilateral or multilateral currency swap lines. Indeed, the urgency and scale of the current COVID-19 pandemic requires immediate response. In particular, policymakers may intend to solely focus on reviving short-term GDP growth to deal with the COVID-induced economic slowdown. However, it is critical for policymakers not to lose sight of our long-term vision for sustainable development when combating the COVID-19 crisis. The current public health crisis is a good example of the repercussions of failing to enhance public health emergency preparedness ex ante. It is the same when we are facing a climate emergency. If we continue to pursue our business as usual, resource-dependent economic growth, greenhouse gas emissions will continue to increase in the next 3 decades. In order to break this pattern, we need to act collectively, which requires universal actions to be taken at local, people, and global levels. Firstly, we will look at local action. Governments need to embed sustainability in policymaking and decarbonize their economies. One way to do so is by removing fossil fuel subsidies. In 2018, these amounted to $240 billion, nearly $100 billion more than investments in renewable energy. Funding needs to be reallocated here, given the current investments in renewable energy are only about a third of the investments required to achieve clean and affordable energy. In this region, investments in coal accounted for about 11.5% of Mongolia's, for example, government budget. In addition to direct subsidies, the Republic of Korea and Japan also heavily invested in coal-related projects abroad. Public finance made up a large part of their overall government support. The same is true for China, which in addition also supports coal through its state-owned entities. China is the world's largest coal investor. The dark blue square represents China's total coal support, which is about 4 times as large as the medium blue square, that is Japan. Japan then is also around 4 times more than the Republic of Korea. In addition to removing fossil fuel subsidies, governments should also adopt carbon pricing. This can lead to drastic reductions in carbon emissions and even create carbon tax revenue. We can see in the graphs that these effects are particularly strong for countries in East and Northeast Asia. These countries have already implemented carbon pricing. The Republic of Korea is in the leading role here, having a national ETS with a high sector coverage and the highest price in this sub-region. China and Japan are catching up and consolidating regional systems. Overall, there is still room for improvement. Carbon prices are too low at the moment to fully account for negative externality of carbon and reach the NDC targets. The third local action is greening the financial system. This can be done with financial incentives, regulatory incentives, and sensible investment decisions. Regarding regulatory incentives, central banks and regulatory agencies from China, Japan, and the Republic of Korea have all joined the NGFS, which is the Network for Greening of Financial System. It is a knowledge-sharing platform for central banks and financial regulators. The Mongolian Financial Regulatory Commission is signatory of TCFD, which is a task force on climate-related financial disclosure. Again, an international peer group of regulators and businesses. China, Japan, and South Korea have also released domestic regulations and policies with the overall shared goal of allocating public and private capital to green sectors. China and Japan already have significant green bond markets. China's actually is the second largest in the world. Japan's is the second largest in Asia. The size of both markets is actually growing rapidly. The Republic of Korea has a dedicated green growth strategy aligned along people and planet goals. It identifies drivers of green growth, enhancing people's quality of life, which contributes to international efforts to fight climate change. Mongolia as well has a national green development strategy, which focuses on renewable energy and resilient infrastructure. However, it faces several challenges in its transition to green economy. The country is dependent on its mining sector, exports, and FDI, and faces deficits in basic infrastructure services. Now, on the people action, we turn to businesses, which need to internalize the externalities of their business operations. For that, they need to incorporate environment, social, and governance aspects decisions into their decision making. Participating in the United Nations Principle for Responsible Investments is one way of doing so. Overall participation is low from Asia Pacific, but Japan is the leader here. It has about 83 companies participating, and from China, we can see about 44 companies and some from Republic of Korea. Secondly, climate risk-related disclosure need to be enhanced. Japan is leading the region in terms of signatories to TCFD, the International Task Force on Climate-Related Disclosure. Lastly, businesses should also adopt internal carbon pricing. More than a third of all companies using or planning to use internal carbon pricing are headquartered in Asia Pacific, which is very good news. In our sub-region, this is particularly strong, being home to the second, fourth, and ninth most companies using internal carbon pricing. All of this adds up in giving eco-conscious investors all the information they need to make sustainable decisions. Thirdly, action by consumers is also required. They need to move towards a more sustainable lifestyle. This includes the areas of food, housing, clothing, and also transportation. Biking, ride-sharing, public transportation lead to a more sustainable lifestyle, while driving and excessive air travel are unsustainable. China, Japan, and Republic of Korea all have some of the most advanced public transportation networks in the world. It will be easier for consumers to live sustainably when businesses and governments give them a push in the right direction. This is called nudging, the technique of making the desired choice easier for a consumer while making other choices more convenient. For example, electricity bills in Japan include consumption data from neighbors, nudging them to compete with each other on who can use the least amount of energy. Innovative apps and services from the businesses community, like ride sharing, can also incentivize the shared use of idle resources. Lastly, global action and cross-border cooperation is required. It is crucial to prevent inactions and raise ambitions. Cooperation on regional climate-related policies and overall climate risk management is needed. Also, climate-related standards need to be harmonized among countries. Regional carbon markets can be a great supporting factor in an overall move towards decarbonization. An example for that is Japan's joint credit mechanism. Japan provides funding for emission-reducing projects in other countries, and Japan and the host country share the received credits that count towards their emissions reduction target. Scaling up transboundary renewable power trade can also help moving towards decarbonization, and in this particular sub-region, Mongolia is ahead. Given its enormous wind power reserves, Mongolia aims to become a renewable energy exporter. The government also promotes an international electric transmission system going through the country. Lastly, countries can implement the 10-year framework program on sustainable consumption and production. Japan focuses on sustainable lifestyles and education. Goals are to minimize the use of natural resources, emissions, waste, and pollution. This needs to be achieved while supporting equitable socioeconomic development. Republic of Korea is especially active in this 10-year framework on sustainable tourism. The program aims to support green tourism policies, collaboration, standardization, and financing. China is contributing heavily on consumer information program in terms of eco-labeling and providing more information on where the products are coming from and made of. Mongolia is not currently part of the 10-year framework, but has made other impressive efforts, mirroring the efforts by other countries in the sub-region. Like Republic of Korea, it is promoting ecotourism, and like China, it is promoting green product labeling. Mongolia partners with international partners and MDBs for projects like wind farms and combating the air pollution. While all these actions are steps in the right direction, it is difficult to measure the impact on the environment. We use an illustrative example from Climate Tracker. Japan, Republic of Korea, and Japan all have committed to Paris Agreement NDC targets. However, the targets are all rated as highly insufficient to stay within the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit. In the case of Republic of Korea, current policy actions are even rated as critically insufficient. For China, current policy actions are expected to improve the contribution to insufficient. We have seen that sustainable development and decarbonization require collective actions by all stakeholders. Let us look at some concluding recommendations. At the local level, governments can reduce fossil fuel subsidies and financial support, at the same time increase presence of carbon pricing. In order to encourage a green recovery, full understanding of green standards will be needed. At the people level, businesses can adopt internal carbon pricing to help with deeper accounting of their environmental footprint. At the consumer level, governments can use nudging to promote sustainable lifestyles. The current crisis shows us that we can live with minimalism. At the global level, cooperation can take several different aspects, such as adhering to green financing for both domestic and foreign direct investments, agreeing on climate standards and regional carbon markets. Following this, I would like to close my presentation with a key message that all stakeholders are important, and we all need to do our part, and we all need to work together, especially during the current unprecedented health and economic crisis. The COVID-19 is a wake-up call for all of us to act now and act fast. Thank you for your attention. More details can be found in the written version of our survey. Over to you, Ganbo.
Okay, thank you, Jyoti. So we appreciate the comprehensiveness of your presentation with broad range of recommendations on government's actions at the national level and what people can do both as consumers and businesses and cross-border actions at the global level. So we'll keep those salient points and your takeaway messages in mind, which I anticipate will resurface later when we will open the floor for our Q&A session. So carrying on, we will now hear from our four panelists who will delve deeper into the theme of the survey 2020 on sustainable consumption and production. Through highlighting country experiences in East and Northeast Asia, our panelists would weigh in on two aspects. First, how has the COVID-19 pandemic affected consumption and production patterns? Second, how can policy measures support post-pandemic recovery as well as promote sustainable means of consumption and production? To start with, may I now introduce Mr. Simon Olson, Senior Policy Researcher with the Institute of Global Environmental Strategies. Mr. Olson has years of experience in sustainable development and environmental governance, ranging from policy research to project design and management. His recent work involved supporting governments in the Asia-Pacific region strengthen their response to the environment-related SDGs. Mr. Olson, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you very much for welcoming the Institute for Global Environment Strategies to provide some comments and inputs in the context of the Economic and Social Survey. Please, next slide. A lot of what is on this slide has already been shared. I suppose what we can ask, we are still in the pandemic and we haven't recovered yet. So what kind of recovery will we see? Will it be green? Will it be back to business as usual? Indeed, will it be a brown recovery? We may see a mix or a mosaic of these different versions of recovery. The pandemic has exposed structural inequalities. It is, in a sense, like a magnifying glass that enables us to see more enhanced and clearer about the problems that we have in our economies, in our societies. And it is linked to unsustainable lifestyles and linked to the climate crisis, because pandemics like COVID-19 appear more likely to occur in the future as a consequence of warming climate and of our expansion, our encroachment on natural habitats. So yes, there are indeed short and long-term impacts on consumption and production. Let me share a few reflections from the Institute for Global Environment Strategies. Next slide, please. So in the context of where I am living in Japan, the burdens have shifted from being primarily workplace oriented and outside to the home, with impacts that include on transportation, on consumption, and on education. For example, there has been less need and less use of mass transit. The rapid Shinkansen trains have largely reduced their operations in the recent months. There has been less need to stay in the urban centers. So in terms of impacts, we might see a regionalization, meaning that people no longer have a need to live in the urban centers and might repopulate some of the parts of Japan that have faced challenges with a dwindling population. So in a sense, that could be a good change. This will impact consumption patterns. For example, if people live more in rural areas, they also need services out there, such as education and health services. This may impact the use of private vehicles from the use of public transport. People may be more prone to take their car rather than sharing a crowded public transport with a risk of catching a virus or another disease. So we can ask ourselves, how will people's carbon footprints be influenced as we increasingly become home-based consumers? What impacts will that have? We do not know yet. In terms of reactions from the Japan government, they have announced a $1.1 trillion recovery to bail out the economy, and very recently adding another 107 trillion, which is almost 1 trillion, 107 trillion Japanese yen more recently. There has been some initiatives, including handing out masks to every household of the country, although not all households, including my own, we have not received those masks yet. And there has been a 100,000 yen stimulus package to each registered taxpayer in the country. That is part of the Japanese experience. But whichever the focus of these stimulus packages, it is important to aim for coherence with the existing frameworks on climate and on sustainable development. Otherwise, short-term stimulus may compromise important long-term goals. In that way, massive stimulus can change the market and accelerate, for instance, renewable energy. We have to remember also, we were, as we saw in the previous presentation, that we were largely off track to meet the SDGs by 2030. So before the pandemic hit, we were not really going in the right direction. That means a recovery needs to take us to a different place and use a different approach. Next slide, please. In the context of research, some important areas for short, medium, and long-term research from the Institute of Global Environment Strategies include addressing urgent concerns, looking into the impacts of medical waste, early warning systems, for example, through wastewater monitoring that can show where cluster infections have happened or are happening. Research into air quality frameworks that are already set up and that should be promoted, and take co-benefit approaches between air pollution, health, climate, and other socioeconomic issues, including the Sustainable Development Goals. On sustainable lifestyles, to research on the uptake of sustainable work styles and lifestyles, working from home, teleworking, such as many of us have experienced in the last months. In the medium term, we want to look at the recovery as a critical occasion to materialize a much needed transformative change toward a sustainable society. It is here important that each country's large-scale economic measures contribute to building a more sustainable, more resilient, and more inclusive society in the future. And providing inputs to a Japanese version of the Green New Deal that links to the achievement of the SDGs and achieves the much needed coherence. For the long term, research areas can include to move forward with transformations toward the achievement of the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals. As I said, these frameworks are even more important now in light of the pandemic. To reduce uncontrolled land development and resulting ecosystem destruction, and rigorously implement climate change countermeasures to reduce the clear impacts of climate change on ecosystems. To build resilient localities that can work together with one another in times of emergency, so that risks can be managed more effectively. And finally, to promote regional circulating and ecological spheres. With regional, I mean subnational regions, which aim for holistic sustainable development at the local level through integrated efforts to achieve diverse social and positive economic and environmental targets. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Olson. Indeed, characterizing the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on consumption and production patterns as reduction, shift, rebound is a very apt description. And certainly taking the three views on the short term, mid-term, and long term helps us map policies as to what we can do immediately and what we can do that would take time to gain traction. So now, may I introduce our next panelist, Ms. Susanna Sumhu, Senior Development Policy and Planning Specialist at the National Development Agency of Mongolia. Ms. Sumhu has been involved with policy and institutional solutions for sustainable development, as well as localizing and mainstreaming the Sustainable Development Goals. Ms. Sumhu is the government technical focal point for the SDGs and Mongolia Voluntary National Review undertaken in 2019. Ms. Sumhu, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gambold. It's a privilege and honor for me to be here, and thank you, ESCAP, for including Mongolia in this important discussion. So I'll go right ahead. Please, next slide. Okay, so previous speakers have mentioned COVID-19 infection is still spreading rapidly, and it is currently difficult to determine its full impact. However, in Mongolia, we can see that the virus has already begun to affect the economy. The economic performances in the first few months of 2020 presents that the general government budget revenue decreased by around 10% compared to the same period of previous year. As a result of decrease in exports by around 30%, the revenue of the mineral industry brings about 24-25% of the general budget revenue, which has decreased as well compared to 2019. Alongside the decrease in exports, the amount of imports also decreased. This is a result of the abrupt drop in demand for commodities in China due to the coronavirus, with more specifically the usage of coal decreasing by 30%. With regards to the quarantine measures, businesses have been closed temporarily in the beginning of the year, but opening in phases considering the containment of the pandemic domestically. Mongolia doesn't have a public outbreak as of now, but it is still at a very high risk. This has had an impact on small, medium enterprises, which could implicate financial stability if the situation worsens in the future. Extensive government measures encouraging people to quickly adopt the habit of washing hands regularly and wearing masks has led to an unprecedented decline in respiratory and intestinal infections, which would usually occur during harsh winter times. Despite these measures, policymakers are attentive to the potential of the crisis undermining prospects for achieving the SDGs. Next slide, please. During the coronavirus pandemic, countries are taking different kinds of measures that are usually common. And as Jyoti already mentioned, countries are increasing financing and investment in the health sector. They're supporting entities with tax policies, supporting business owners with monetary policies. As for Mongolia, last month in April, the parliament has adopted a law on preventing, combating, and mitigating the impacts of the virus. As for the government, starting from early March to now, the government is also taking certain step-by-step fiscal measures to protect the vulnerable households and businesses and to support the economy. These measures include tax exemptions on several imported food and medical items, increase of child allowance and employment benefits, which not only includes children, but also vulnerable groups such as people with disabilities and those in poverty. Exemptions on Social Security contributions, and an increase in credit guarantees to SMEs and soft loans from the Development Bank to cashmere producers. So as you can see, two-staged economic stimulus package is still currently being implemented. But I want to draw my attention to the governance aspect of implementing the SDGs during these difficult times. Despite the pandemic, the Parliament has adopted the amendment to the Constitution last year in November, and according to the Constitution, important statutes have been included regarding SDGs and development policies. One measure has been the revision of the law on development policy planning and management, which was just adopted last month. And I want to emphasize this law because according to this law, Mongolia in the future will be reshuffling and organizing the types of development policies and the plans and coherence of it. So this law includes specific articles and statutes on conducting policy coherence assessments and further looking at the interlinkages across economic, social, environmental aspects of policy measures. And we see that this is an opportunity for us to orient the integrated medium and short-term policies to be formulated in the coming months in accordance with the elections and the new government, but also implement policy coherence, vertical and horizontal, and build resilience and ensure greater linkage with the newly determined NDCs that we've just adopted last year, as well as the green taxonomy measures in the financing sector, and including renewable energy and climate adaptation measures that we're currently developing at the moment. Despite the uncertainty across the board, we see that we have an opportunity to build back better on the foundations of the Agenda 2030. That means forging common solutions to the climate crisis, economic and social inequalities. So next few months and years will be critical in Mongolia in potentially reorienting our development paradigm towards a more sustainable future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susanna. So taking off from your sharing of Mongolia's law on development policy, planning and its management, which mobilized whole of government action. I believe such an action aims to also trigger beyond the government sector a whole of society approach. This responds well to the call for concerted action, which is the key to achieving the 2030 agenda. Now, may I introduce our next panelist, Ms. Hae-kyung Lee, legislative researcher from the National Assembly Research Service of the Republic of Korea, which provides policy and legal analysis exclusively to lawmakers and committees of the National Assembly, regardless of party affiliation. She also joined the Global Green Growth Institute as a Cambodia manager. Ms. Lee, the floor is yours.
Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you may be on the planet. It is my honor and pleasure to have this opportunity, and I appreciate the invitation. My name is Helen, and I work for the National Assembly as a legislative researcher on environmental laws. I provide resources to all lawmakers, regardless of party affiliation. The following presentation is a representation of my own opinion as an individual and has no relationship to my organization's thoughts on the matter whatsoever. Next slide, please. In regard to the first question, I would like to show some examples of negative and positive impacts. My first point is that COVID-19 increases waste in South Korea. For instance, it has become mostly mandatory to wear facial masks in public places, and people prefer medical masks to the cloth masks. So large amount of medical waste are being generated. As you can see the picture at the top, an Australian citizen found several gloves at the beach. This indicates that Korea is not alone in the environmental damage that the pandemic response has caused. And the increased volume of delivery due to the social isolation and the increased caution has exacerbated the already existing problems related to the excessive packaging. As you can see in the middle pictures, communities are suffering from the increased packaging waste. The second point is that the government sacrifices its environment policy in the short term. For example, the government had a plan to phase out single-use items step by step. For instance, the regulation to use plastic or paper cups in coffee shop led to 70% reduction of waste from coffee shop last year. This reveals that the policy was quite effective. However, due to the COVID-19, some exceptions were allowed, so the paper or plastic cups are back in coffee shop nowadays. Another example is the election of last month. Korea had a very successful and safe election in April. As you can see the picture at the bottom, every voter had to wear 2 plastic gloves even after using hand sanitizer. Actually, environmental NGOs proposed to use the bioplastic gloves, but it has not been implemented. As a result, the estimated 58 million plastic gloves were wasted only for the election. However, there has also been a positive impact. Originally, the government was reluctant to adopt European-style Green Deal, but it has recently embraced the Green Deal for COVID-19 recovery plan. Though the Korean Green Deal is lacking in detail, it is desirable for the government to eventually embrace the Green New Deal. Next slide, please. It feels wrong to criticize the government for prioritizing the citizen health rather than the environmental impacts during this pandemic. However, I believe that government should take actions to prioritize the environmental impact even during this pandemic. When the government implements new policies, it should also take into consideration policies that address the environment impact. Some scientists present that pandemics are going to occur more often without the implementation of more sustainable development policies. So I would like to call upon the government to bring attention to the following points. First, it is important to raise awareness of the environment in policymaking. For example, local governments are suffering from insufficient incineration capacities. The central government announced that it was considering a waste import ban. However, I believe that in this process, the reduction of national waste should also be emphasized. Secondly, it is crucial to decide whether or not the government will keep the temporary deregulation or not after the pandemic. As far as I know, the EU will keep its plan for plastic ban even after the pandemic. However, it is not clear whether the Korean government will keep, delay, or give up its plan to ban plastic and paper cups in coffee shop by next year. So we need clear guidelines. Finally, I believe that the integration of new policies into the Sustainable Development Goals should be emphasized. For example, when the government develops the Korean Green New Deal into a policy, I think it should integrate the Korean Green New Deal into the Korean Sustainable Development policies. Without it, I'm afraid the Korean Green New Deal could just be a form of propaganda rather than an effective policy. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you, Helen. The examples you presented with the negative impacts of COVID-19 against positive impacts, to a certain extent drives the point that amidst the challenges, there are still opportunities we can use as entry points to improve the situation. And now, may I introduce our last in sequence panelist, Mr. Dongjang Fan. Mr. Dong currently works at the Chinese Academy of Environmental Planning, directly under the Ministry of Ecology and Environment, and acted as the Associate Director of the Environmental Policy Institute. Mr. Dong is engaged in environmental strategy and plan, environmental and economic policy. Mr. Dong, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Very happy to join the discussion. I will introduce the post-COVID-19 recovery with sustainable development, the Chinese situation. Next slide, please. Well, no, that the COVID-19 is a global challenge for China. Suffers a lot and had great impact on lots of aspects as economic, social, and the environment. I will give you everyone a brief introduction about the impacts from these three angles, and how China responds to this impact. Firstly, for economic impact, we can see that the COVID-19 has a short-term impact on the Chinese economy, and it's very large. We can see the economic indicators in the first quarter this year. From these economic indicators compared to this in last year, we can see how the impact for production GDP is 206 trillion yuan, which is about 6 6.8% decrease compared to the last year. For the primary industry, for 3.2%, the secondary industry is 9.6%, and the tertiary industry for 5.2%. For the investment indicator, we can see that the fixed asset investment for 16.1 compared to this last year. For the CPI, CPI rose 4.9%, and the PPI for 0.6%. For the foreign trade indicator, we can see that the total value of imports and exports of goods for 6.4. And under this background, China issued 3 batches of special tests to incentive the economy, such as the special debt on the transportation, infrastructure, and energy projects, and environment protection projects. Next, please. And the direct impact on the Chinese economic forecasts 3 major areas, including the service sectors, the manufacturing, and the foreign trade. And the foreign trade below is some of the information and the debt from one impact is increased, but and on the other hand, it gives some incentive to some industries. For example, for short term, that revenues from online education, e-commerce, online games, and entertainment industries have risen sharply. Sorry. For example, the online retail sales of physical goods rose 5.9%, and the information and technology service industries and the financial industry increased by 13% and 6% respectively. For the long term, I think in fact these crises promote the medical devices, the biological industries, and the 5G and artificial intelligence. These industry sectors have some opportunities. Next. And for the social impacts, we can see that the COVID-19 pandemic prevention and control has promoted the risk of no-touch working lifestyles. And at the first stage, someone think that the COVID-19 might cost some inconvenience of the work, but as the time go on, can see that that the no-touch working lifestyle is more pure, and to some extent promote the worker efficiency. And the instability increases the difficulty of policy formulation and implementation. Yes. Also caused consumption panics and waste of resources for some residents. For example, masks, protective clothing, anti-killing supplies, and other healthy prevention control materials are out of stock and caused some social instability. Okay, next slide, please. And the third is the ecological environmental impact. We can see that COVID-19 has some favorite factors to the environmental protection, and also have some unfavorable factors. Before the Ministry of Ecological and Environment, the largest challenges is how to guarantee prevent and prevent the environmental crises including the rapidly increased waste, medical waste, and sewage, and expanded production capacity in some industries increased the pollution emissions. Also, how to carry out an effective on-site supervision is a big challenge for MEE. Okay, next slide, please. Under this background, MEE itself and coordinate some other ministries and departments issued and implement lots of ecological environment policies to guarantee the environmental safety. The policies on the medical wastes, on the sewage treatment, and recently how to guarantee the worker recovery during the worker recovery period, the environmental protection. And the second is to promote and strengthen environmental emergency management. For example, we well know that Hubei province is heavy regions, and the disposal capacity of medical waste has doubled than before, from 118 tons per day to 373 tons per day. And Wuhan city had increased from the 15 tons per day to 100 tons per day, and which is a big challenges for Wuhan city and Hubei province. Under this condition, MEE do lots of work to help Wuhan and Hubei increase this pollution treatment capability at a short time. And we can see for now, no environmental crises or accidents occurred. I think this is very this is not easy. Okay, next slide, please. For the detailed policy measures of the post-pandemic recovery, as well as promote sustainable means of consumption and production. Chinese government do lots of the policy measures at the economic and environmental levels, and for example, the economic developing policies mainly focused on promote effective macroeconomic policies to promote the sustainable development. For example, the fiscal policy will be more proactive, trying to improve the efficiency of fund to stabilize the economy. Also, the monetary policy, the central bank such as cuts, interest rate cuts, the relending to maintain reasonable and sufficient liquidity, and try to guard the low market interest to rate to fall, support green investment. Use funds to support the real economy, especially to the small and medium-sized enterprises in China. For those enterprises is a very difficult period, and maintain the stability of the supply chain system. We all know that the COVID-19 posed a big challenge to the trade affairs, and how to guarantee the stability of the supply chain system for China is a very very difficult, and but have to do well in this aspect. And the Chinese do lots of policy measures to promote the work, such as the guarantee the normal self-production of materials, and use the policy tools such as the loans, the credits, to give the enterprise the most convenient ways to promote the operation of the enterprises. Okay, next slide, please. And also made some ecological environmental protection policies, and policies mainly focused on establish a healthy response mechanism for major emergency, such as the policies as I mentioned just now. The policies on the emission standards of the sewage plant, of the solid waste disposal and treatment facilities, under the monitoring regulation and but I think this is just one hand. On the other hand, one ME formulate these ecological environmental protection policies, also considering how to function environmental protection to the economical and social development. And the policy including the green financing and the tax and subsidy for the pollution treaty facilities building and operation, and also make great efforts to do well at the information disclosure to leisure the public and promote the everyone, including the enterprises, the public participate in the world of the COVID-19. And the second aspect is to integrating biosecurity into the national security system. And Chinese government is promote the biosafety law under the draft has passed through, and now this work. Now this is in the process of the so how to say to ask the propose suggestion of the related stakeholders. Okay, next slide. Oh, okay. That's all. My presentation, just a brief introduction of the COVID-19 during the COVID-19 period, the Chinese efforts in the economic, social, and environmental policy. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Dong. So your presentation elaborated well on the impacts of the pandemic across different dimensions: economic, social, and ecological. And similarly, identified both economic development policies as well as on ecological environmental protection policies to address the adverse impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. So now I'd like to thank presenter Jyoti and all our 4 panelists for the very comprehensive, informative, and very insightful presentations. Shifting gear at this point, we now open the floor for the Q&A session. So we have received questions through registration. So we are also monitoring the YouTube chat box. So I would like to ask our viewers on YouTube to send out your questions through YouTube chat box. Time permitting, we will endeavor to respond to all queries. And for those which we could not raise on the floor, we will surely get in touch with you to address your queries. First, we hope to bring to the floor participants who have submitted their questions through registration. So may I call on Mr. Florian Miss, Project Director from GIZ in Beijing. Your question, please, and to whom it is addressed to.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gunwald and UNSCAP, as well as the panelists for this very insightful webinar. Working with GIZ on regional economic cooperation and integration in Asia, we encountered most of the issues that were raised during the webinar as well. And I would like to raise a question concerning long-term effects with regard to recovering from COVID-19, as well as the UNSCAP survey 2020. So a transition towards a sustainable economy or towards sustainable economies in the long term would also need strong adjustments of education systems. So, for example, to have respective sustainable subjects or approaches from elementary school on, having strong vocational education for new technologies, having new cross-disciplinary academic approaches, etc. Are policymakers in Northeast Asia focusing enough on these issues, or are most measures too short-term, too business-oriented? I would like to address this question to Ms. Lee and or Mr. Olson. Thank you.
Yeah, please go ahead, Helen, and then Mr. Olson. Helen, your microphone is mute.
So sorry, yeah, sorry. I don't reckon the supply meet the demand. And regardless of the ranks of the term in Korea, I believe the society should provide more learning opportunity for those willing to learn, and government should give more incentives for those mechanisms. However, it doesn't work well in Korea. For example, in the school education, environmental class is not mandatory. So less than 10% of middle and high school is providing the environmental class. Also, there is a compulsory education under Korean labor law. For example, employers are obliged to provide education on preventing sexual harassment at work, protecting personal information, occupational safety and health issues, and protecting the rights of persons with disabilities. However, the sustainable development education is optional for employers. So therefore, in my opinion, the government should develop various policy incentives to improve education systems in and out of school. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Olson.
Thank you. I think there are some examples in Japan. For example, education for sustainable development has been quite active and strong in Japan for years now under the Ministry of Education. It caused a jump in schools that undertook ESD, or Education for Sustainable Development. Between 2005, I believe there were 19 schools, and to 2016, where there were more than 1,000. So at least in the books, as it were, the numbers look promising and positive. In addition, what Jyoti mentioned before, that Japan is leading the program in the 10-year framework of programs for sustainable consumption and production, the program on sustainable lifestyles and education. So I believe there are initiatives that promote sustainable development in the context of education, both here in Japan and abroad. But to take it a little bit broader, maybe we should not only think about teaching environment and sustainability in particular subjects that deal with environment and sustainability. I would like to see, this is just my very personal opinion, a stronger focus on systems thinking in education from elementary school and upwards, or subjects such as home economics, or gardening, farming. How do we interact with nature? I believe that some of these elementary and foundational subjects need to receive much more attention if we have to move in the right direction.
Okay, thank you. And now I have another question came through the registration from Professor Gotov Dugurjev of the Mongolian University of Science and Technology. In the context of the shared borders between China and Mongolia, this question is addressed to Ms. Sumhu and Mr. Dong. The question is, COVID-19 pandemic calls for a cooperative, transparent, targeted, science-based, and coordinated regional response. The economic challenges, the continued efficient flow of medical supplies, food products, and other goods across borders will be critical for effective crisis response. What measures should be taken in short run to minimize disruptions to cross-border trade and regional supply chains? Please go ahead, Susanna. Then Mr. Dong.
Okay, thank you for the question, Mr. Qattaw. Well, there's certainly economic risks, and the situation is still difficult to foresee at the moment at a global scale as well. So risks continue to grow for the economic prospects. And of course, in Mongolia, as you rightly said, foreign and domestic environment for our economy is crucial, as we are dependent on exports and imports for our economy. So I think the difficult answer or the convoluted answer would be we would have to see for in terms of long term, but short term, what we can do and what with the resources that we have is making sure that we are in fact implementing an accommodative macroeconomic policy, that fiscal and monetary policies indeed considering the trade aspects with China. But also on the ground, we have to make sure that, you know, the people working at the borders, people who are engaged in the supply chain processes, the logistics operation of it, are indeed safe and they are able to work. It's great that Mongolia doesn't have a public outbreak yet, thus we are still have exports ongoing, imports ongoing, and more or less people are calm domestically. So it is, you know, at the moment it's, I would say, safe, and the government is taking action with the economic stimulus package. But again, we don't know, you know, globally, the virus is still spreading and Mongolia is still at a very high risk. So we just have to invest in the health more, make sure and prepare for bad times if there is any, unfortunately. And then, you know, monetary and fiscal policy would have to really focus on making sure the economy is running smoothly. Thank you.
Mr. Dong? Mr. Dong, are you with us?
Okay. This is a good question. I think that in China, the government make every effort to to promote the operation of the supply chains, and the main measures I think first is to make every efforts to protect the safety of the public, and the Chinese government make crisis level classification, and for those readings with heavy conditions such as Hubei province, the Chinese government takes these regions as the at a high level crisis regions, and for the regions, Chinese government take very strict measures to protect the health of the public, and I think in fact this make a big impact on the economic development of the regions, and also for the supply chain. But for some areas such as Shanghai, such as Chongqing, these regions is not so heavy, and no COVID-19 cases was found. For this place, the Chinese government promote quickly to function the economy, and I think that the regional supply chains for these regions is rapidly functioning with lots of incentive measures, such as the monetary measures, the created the lines, the measures. So I think one of the most important measures is according to the crisis level classification. Based on this, the Chinese government take lots of measures to promote the regional supply chains function. I think maybe this have a process, and for now we all know that in China the COVID-19 is basically not so heavy for most of the regions. I think that the regional supply chains for China maybe now is gradually becoming better than before. Just so, thanks.
So I have thank you for the comprehensive answers provided. So I have a question to address to Jyoti. As a business owner, investor, in which industry fields should we transition? Which industry is projected to have growth after these effects and transition? So this is from Jason Sarmiento. So Jyoti?
Okay, thank you, Ganbol. Thank you for this question, Jason. I think that's a great question, where the future is. And I think one way to look at is where's the jobs, where are the jobs going to be in the future? And one of the things I think we've highlighted in the survey and also in the presentation is that most of the jobs in fossil fuel industry are going to become obsolete very soon. And the ILO, the International Labour Organization, estimates in Asia Pacific it will be about 400,000. And at the same time, there will be a net gain of about 14 million jobs in this Asia Pacific in the green industry, which includes, and I think, Jason, you mentioned that you're in the retail and construction and real estate business. That will include greening the buildings as well. Renewable energy, of course, electricity generation, the way we live, the way we transport, electric vehicles. So all these jobs are going to actually substantively increase in the near future. And the jobs which are really fossil fuel based in the industry, they are going to actually go down substantively. So that's kind of one measure to see where the future growth is. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jyoti. So, and I have another question addressed to you and Mr. Olson. How to prioritize and resolve the conflicts, if any, between sustainable economies and the most needed economic recovery in view of the COVID-19 pandemic? Jyoti?
Okay, thank you, Ganbol. Again, a great question. I think prioritizing between multiple things which are kind of bombarding at everybody, governments and people-wise as well, and during this crisis time, I think it's difficult. I think I want to emphasize our main message remains, which is also in the presentation, is that people should be prioritized over economic recovery. And if that priority is very clear, then there should not be any conflict. Countries need to first do whatever they can to contain this pandemic and save lives. Of course, the next question becomes recovering the economy and maintaining financial stability, which are also important. And I think we are beginning to see that in this particular region in East and Northeast Asia, where this transition is actually already happening. And this is also important, again, for the people, for the sake of guaranteeing minimum standards of living, safeguarding their livelihoods in the short run. And then, given we are in this emergency situation, fostering sustainable economies is critical to actually protect people. Again, it is the people and planet in the long run, which is, I think, going to a lot of the presentations, including Simon's. Each short-term step is going to actually cumulatively affect our medium-term and our long-term impact. That's it for me. Over to you, Simon.
Thank you, Jyoti. I cannot really add anything. It was a really good input to a difficult question. I just want to say, as of now, already $10 trillion have been handed out cumulatively all over the world as a stimulus to the economy. And at least if we read the news, there's expectations that as much as $100 trillion could flow to revive the economies. That is a lot of money. That is a big chance to change the discourse or change the way we are moving in the future from a one that produces social inequality and environmental degradation towards something that has more to do with quality of life and people. So we need to rebuild, but perhaps we should take it slow rather than hurrying to build back to full steam, because ridding the global economy of the fossil fuel addiction, I think, is not an easy task, and quite a few different things need to be maneuvered in place in order to do a sustainable and green recovery.
Thank you, Simon. And I have a question addressed to Helen and Mr. Dong. Practical policies have been implemented by each country to encourage or nudge sustainable production and consumption. Can these policies still work under post-COVID? Can they be strengthened to ensure building back better? Helen?
Yes, I believe political leadership and social consensus is are very important, and the EU could be a good example. With the leadership and consensus, the EU Green Deal is expected to drive the EU recovery effort. Without the leadership and consensus, it is hard to expect the sustainable policies will be back post-COVID-19 as it was. Problem is that developing countries could have difficulties in following the EU's example due to the lack of resources and capacities. Therefore, I hope ESCAP will be able to find solutions and keep supporting those countries. Thanks.
Mr. Dong?
Hey, thanks. I think this good question. I think in China that the policies still work, but I think maybe we need to worry about that. We all know that in order to recover the economy, the Chinese government has increased in investment in some areas like the transportation and the infrastructure fields and other fields. And recently, Chinese government put forward new infrastructure construction and strategy. I think how to ensure that the investment does not have great impacts on the ecology and the environment, and also from other aspect perspective, how to ensure more investor can be enter into the field of ecological environmental protection. I think this challenge. We need to establish an effective green investment mechanism. For example, we must have the standards or the criteria to guarantee the environment orientation. In other pacts, for example, how to under the economical process, how to carry out the environmental protection. I think for Chinese government, the decision is very follow the Chinese the MEE recently the MEE has posted these questions and declare to the public and the direction and the strengths of the environmental protection. Keep constant as before, and under this background.
Okay.
I think this is the basic conditions of the ME, and ME also how to promote the work, and ME put out some measures. For example, in the environmental monitoring and supervision. With the UAV, with the UAV base, and we also do lots of work how to give the technical and the policy guidance to the enterprises to promote the enterprises can operate during the COVID-19 period. We all know under this during this period that the enterprise has a lot of prices, and the Chinese government issued lots of policies, including the environmental protection policies, and some of enterprises don't know how to respond to the policies, how to guarantee the pollution emission to meet the environmental standards, and the ME required every level of the the Department of the Environmental Protection to provide to give great efforts or guidance to the enterprises to promote the operation of the enterprises. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Helen and Mr. Don. So I see a question came through in our chat room. So from Mr. Lee, how to make it happen to build the cooperation among North and East Asia to fulfill the SDGs and fight with COVID-19? And from Andre Abramian, there are many unilateral steps being taken and some bilateral ones in response to COVID-19. Do you think some truly sub-regional initiatives might be possible? So if I may, I'll address this question. Maybe then I'll ask also Jyoti to jump in. The impacts of the pandemic are unprecedented and don't recognize borders. Hence the impetus to even reinforce regional cooperation. In the context of the East and Northeast Asian subregion, leveraging from its strengths to address its challenges, several modalities of regional cooperation are already being set in motion. First, through open and information and experience sharing among multi-stakeholders. Northeast Asian economies are among the strongest advocates of greening the recovery. So these sharing are beneficial to raise awareness and provide perspectives for countries on how they could adapt approaches to their own circumstances. Secondly, through development cooperation, East and Northeast Asian economies have come to play an increasingly important role in development assistance. And this could be an effective tool to ensure that assistance addressing post-pandemic recovery also reinforces sustainable development objectives. As many have characterized with this pandemic, the effects are broad-based and the virus thrives on inequality. Hence, all these modalities, inclusive and broad-based regional cooperation is warranted more than ever. So Jyoti, can you reflect on this bit?
Yes, thank you, Ganbold. And I think this is a great question. I think I've mentioned a couple of things which are actually happening in this particular sub-region in my presentation on some of the sustainable policies on consumption and production. What I would like to highlight here is in the short term to really contain this pandemic. Already some things are happening. There is, I think, let me highlight three particular points on this. First one is on regional emergency funding. In the presentation, I've used the example of Japan. It is contributing to IMF's two of the trust funds which have been set up to fight this pandemic. In addition, we've seen from South Asia, there's a SARC emergency fund specifically for COVID-19, which has been announced and established, where countries are coming together to fight this. And as Ganbold, you said, it doesn't see any borders at this point, right? So, these are the small things, but that's what is going to make difference because we are coming together as one people. Second point is on financial stability. And some of the mechanisms on financial stability which were already put in place on swap market. There's a multilateral ASEAN mechanism in place, and China has been actually trying to establish the swap market with Korea, with Japan. So all these are actually helping. These mechanisms have been actually rejuvenated, during this crisis time to encourage financial stability. The third one is on sharing, knowledge sharing platform, where countries are sharing information and can continue to do even better, right? And I think at this point, at this time, many countries are looking for information, for expertise. It's not just financial. So I think that's another area where we can actually do much better. And if it's not happening, we can do. And countries which have been able to contain, they can actually help the countries which are trying to still manage this crisis. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jyoti. So I received another question addressed to Ms. Sumhu, Susanna, and Ms. Jyoti again. The question is from Mr. Bayar Davadorj, Executive Director of the Long-Term Partners of Mongolia, LLC. Financing needs for sustainable development is huge. This becomes more challenging for a country with limited fiscal space. What practices have been done to ensure that SDGs are incorporated in government budget priorities and financing? How can international organizations help fill the gap? So, Susanna?
Sure, thank you. So in Mongolia, I would say three types of measures have been taken. Firstly, more of the structural issues, because SDGs, although it was adopted in 2015, as you mentioned earlier, the foundation of budget planning process itself and the financial management process itself has not been as strong as we would like already. So building on that ground, when we mainstream SDGs into budgeting, we have to make sure that the mechanism is fundamentally strong enough. So keeping that in mind, the government has been working with UN Mongolia here, especially UNDP, in advancing the medium-term public finance reform, particularly to improve strategic resource allocation and macroeconomic management. And by doing so, we are aiming to strengthen the effectiveness and efficiency of public expenditures in line with development goals and objectives that Mongolia has set forth. And we see that this could improve transparency and accountability in public finance management. And this could potentially help us develop the integrated national financing framework that we are planning on developing. But more specifically, the second point that we would like to highlight is the issue of capacity and the tools and approaches that we need. So it's still new, right? How do we integrate? How do we make sure that our budget is driven towards SDGs, not just informed, but driven to achieve the SDGs? So in that line, government has been working to basically 3 steps to do SDG budgeting. Firstly, our Ministry of Finance has worked with UNDP to pilot in one sector to do SDG budgeting. And then ultimately, we are aiming to go deeper into informing the budget on SDGs. Then introduce SDG-based budgeting, where the process is more bottom-up. And by informing the budget with SDGs, firstly, we looked at the health sector. So this work has been ongoing a year ago. So we've engaged with the Ministry of Health, and then now we've moved on to Ministry of Environment. So developing specific budgeting templates for each sector for marginal budgeting. And ultimately, what we want to see is that health policy planners and environmental sector policy planners speak the SDG language when they plan their budgets. And ultimately, these templates have been used for the 2020 annual budgets. But I want to emphasize that ultimately, annual budgets are annual budgets. What we want to focus on is medium-term budgets, which could include medium-term expenditure frameworks. So in that line, we need to build on strengthening the public finance management, along with the various components that go with it. So this would basically ensure a strong backbone to how we SDG budget. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Jyoti, could you address the second part of the question on the international organizations support?
Yes, Kanbol, thank you. Again, I think, there are 2 kind of gaps. First is a financial gap, second is a knowledge gap. And I think in both of these instances, international organizations, international financial institutions can actually help. Just to take example of Mongolia, for example, most of the multilateral organizations which are active in this particular region, World Bank Group, Asian Development Bank, AIIB, IMF, they've all come together to put a package together to help Mongolia in its economic stimulus package, about 147 billion. So in terms of financing, yes, and I think the idea is to match the needs for where economic stimulus is needed and where emergency help is needed and support is needed and where international organizations can help. And I think that matching exercise is kind of crucial. The second major area is knowledge gap, and I think it mentions a little bit to Susanna's point on capacity and capacity is a big issue in a lot of the countries, and reacting on an emergency situation, especially in unprecedented, it's even bigger. So I think that's one of the reasons where in my presentation, I had presented this policy tracker, COVID policy tracker, which the team in UNESCAP has put together, where actually anybody can go and click on every country's packages which they have announced in different areas in fiscal and monetary and what they are trying to do. And since each country context is different, right? I mean, one practice in a developed country cannot be applied to another, maybe a developing country. But what each policymaker or a government, a person sitting in and making these decisions need to kind of see is what context is relevant for them. And I think these kind of knowledge sharing tools are really, really helpful. We've also put lessons learned together. So I think in terms of knowledge gap, UNESCAP can really add value to this. That's it for now. Thank you, Gunvold. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Jyoti. So now we already behind the scheduled time. So there are several questions unaddressed. So we will respond later on through our registry or other email channels. So, and with that, on a high note, we bring the virtual policy dialogue to a close. It was indeed a fruitful experience with the rich exchanges. We hope that the key recommendations and messages from 2020 economic survey, the perspectives given through the country experiences, as well as the questions raised and responses provided, have given us a deeper understanding on how to align post-pandemic recovery with sustainable development. More importantly, it has helped us identify possible ways to collaborate in the future as a subregion to advance our shared goals. Together, we can build back better. I would like to extend our deep appreciation to our panelists, Ms. Jyoti Bisbee, Mr. Dongjan Fan, Simon Olson, Susanna Sumhu, and Hye Kyung Lee. Thank you as well to our participants who sent questions and joined us in the Q&A session. And to all of you who have been with us in the last few hours. All the presentations will be posted on the events page. We hope you could also provide your comments through the evaluation survey. And thank you and take care.